Welcome. I'm Andreas Wittmer, Director of Entrepreneurship Programs in the New School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America. Our next speaker for the conference, Liberty and Solidarity, Living the Vocation to Business, is Catherine Rook Pakaluk. Dr. Pakaluk is an assistant professor of economics at Ave Maria University, a faculty research fellow at the Stein Center for Social Research, and a senior fellow in economics at the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. Her work on the interpretation and history of Catholic social thought gives her authority to speak to us today on the topic, what is solidarity and how does it apply to the marketplace?
I wanted to try to shed some light on what solidarity is. I kind of think that it's hard to come up with a definition. I think if most people were asked, if one of us were asked, if you asked me a couple of years ago before I started thinking hard about this, I would have talked around solidarity a lot. And I wouldn't have had a quick and easy definition. And I think we want a definition for a variety of reasons. And this is difficult. So I have a straw man up here because I think in addition to those of us who are really interested in knowing what the definition is, there's also a lot of kind of straw men out there about solidarity, and I wanted to highlight a couple of them. My favorite, and maybe sort of the worst, is the straw man idea of solidarity as taxes. So taxes are solidarity, and this is not so common in this country, but in Quebec and Canada and all over the EU, taxes get named for solidarity. So here's an example from Germany. This large portion, which is called shared taxes, contains a solidarity surcharge, for example, and that's not uncommon. I don't think we have this in the US yet, but it's all over the EU. So now I'm not saying that there's no sense in which taxes could represent something of solidarity, but I am saying that that's not what solidarity is. Solidarity just isn't taxes. Right? So that's kind of a straw man. Another one, kind of a popular straw man, is the idea that solidarity is giving things away. Right, kind of giving stuff away. So I have Goodwill up here in the Salvation Army, and I have President Obama at a soup kitchen. And these are they're kind of partial truths. They're kind of parts of solidarity, but they're not solidarity. There's also the idea that solidarity kind of encapsulates our sense of the preferential option for the poor. And that's another one of these. I'll call it a straw man. It's not that it's not related to solidarity, but it's not sort of the essence of solidarity. You get to the preferential option for the poor from understanding what the heart of solidarity is. All right, so, and the last one, which is not exactly fair to call this a straw man, but we have, right, Christian labor unions, solidarity movement, and this is becoming kind of a thing of the past, but this is also there. So I think there's kind of a blurry thing. So where's this blurry thing coming from? And I think it's coming from the fact that if you start to, kind of parse through a lot of what's in the social teaching on solidarity, you kind of find a lot of long stuff, right? Like I'm just going to say long stuff, lots of paragraphs of stuff. So one of our favorite ones, of course, is John Paul II, Solicitudo 38, right? So we have this, idea that, my slides are doing something funny, right? The idea that solidarity is a firm and persevering commitment to the common good, right? So this isn't wrong. This is interesting. This is helpful. Now, I do want to say, though, that if solidarity is this firm and persevering commitment to the common good, it puts a lot on solidarity. So we know that all of social life should be ordered to the common good. So if all of social life should be ordered to the common good, kind of all of the virtues that help us get to the common good should be encapsulated by solidarity. And that is sort of too much to put on solidarity, I think. We also have in 38 we have interdependence, which you'll see a lot in connection with solidarity. We have the sense that we are all responsible for all. You'll see that a lot. And this is all in one paragraph. So in one paragraph, you have several different ideas about what solidarity could be. In the catechism, I'm intentionally skipping over parts of the catechism. I'm pulling out a part of the catechism which I think just takes us in a completely different direction all of a sudden. We have the idea that solidarity is manifested in the first place by the distribution of goods and remuneration for work. So this is a new idea. This wasn't over here. not directly. So we're kind of looking for definitions, and this is difficult. This one is a little bit difficult for me in the sense that if solidarity is essentially a firm and persevering commitment to the common good, and if the common good is transcendent and not material, it's hard to see how in the first place solidarity is manifested by the distribution of goods. So there's potentially a conflict there. This is my last example of some of the, okay. Yeah, that's exactly the reaction I wanted you to have. I'm not going to read through this. This is a compendium of social doctrine of the church on solidarity, and although I keep looking at it, and my Latin is not very good, you can't find the expression solidarity is in all of that. So there's a lot of talking around, but there's no sort of solidarity is, right? And so, as an economist, I'm looking for a definition. I kind of want a definition, but I think we all want definitions. So not that any of this is wrong or bad, it's just not, this is where we get this fuzzy thing. And so sometimes as you're reading through the popes on solidarity, you kind of have this idea that every pope kind of emphasizes something different about solidarity. So I've kind of got this handoff of popes up here from John Paul II to Benedict to Francis. It's a little bit confusing. So now I'm wondering if maybe you're thinking I'm not being fair. So maybe you're thinking that actually we're thinking about sort of theological stuff, and theological stuff is hard to define. So maybe you think I'm kind of being a little, unfair. So here I have sort of an awesome old Italian schema of the entire Summa, right? So, so it'd be difficult to pull out a clean definition from here, right? And I say, well, sort of right. Let's pull out some of the definitions in the Catechism on things we understand. So the Catechism on sin. So it starts with sin is. All right, so that's nice. And then this could be shorter, but it's clear. Sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. All right, so that's what we'd kind of like to have. Grace is even better. So grace, and I will tell you that, it would take more than this room to hold all of the scholarly debates on what grace is, right? So it's not as if grace in the tradition is a sort of a simple matter, right? And yet we have grace as a participation in the life of God. So we have a clean definition of grace. And in case you're thinking sin and grace are too easy to define, and I'm still being unfair, prudence is not so easy to define, and we still have that prudence is. And actually the first line in the Catechism, which I'm not going to show you at the moment, on solidarity does not start with solidarity is. It starts with solidarity is also articulated as, which is sort of to say it goes by these other names. And then it goes on. So it still doesn't kind of tell you what solidarity is. So I kind of think we can do better. We need to sort of improve this. And as with all good things, and as with all rich things, the church is kind of moving forward, trying to kind of come up with the contours of this thing. So I'm going to be completely sort of outrageous, and I'm going to try to give you a solidarity is right now. And I feel that if I were better at using my technology, I could put a watermark on this that says draft. So I am not the Office of Justice and Peace, and I have no authority to define solidarity, except that, so this is a draft. Okay, so this is a draft idea, which is we're kind of working through. But I think it's not entirely wrong. It may not be entirely right yet, but it's not entirely wrong. All right, so here's what we have. So we have solidarity is unity arising from fraternal charity. And all of the pieces are important because I'm going to try to take for you, kind of 150 years of thoughts and pack it into 3 words. I don't know if I can do this or not. All right, so the words have an order to them. Now, solidarity is we have unity arising from fraternal charity. Now, it's an unfortunate accident of the English language that I cannot put the adjective after the noun, right? So I'd like to say unity arising from charity, which is fraternal, or a fraternal kind of charity. So I can't do that, but the fraternal is the first one. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I'm going to try to run you through 1, 2, 3 and show you where all of that fuzziness we saw earlier, all of that good stuff can fall under this, that I think is kind of helpful. So fraternity, this encapsulates these things which were in the teaching: recognition of common humanity and mutual responsibility arising from interdependence. All right, so that all sounds a little okay. What are we talking about? You see this formulation over and over in in the church's writings on solidarity. This kind of constant reference back, whenever the popes are talking about solidarity, there's this constant reference back that there's this common humanity, common destiny. So we're kind of all men are brothers. This is brotherhood, fraternity, created in the same image of God, have the same destiny. All right, so the idea here is kind of a sense of fraternity. Brothers, sisters, siblings, they all kind of look the same, don't they? So I had to do it. All right, so of course this was a common impulse of the early Christians to sort of say, well, actually, no, the bases for commonality among human beings change after Jesus is, right, after Jesus Christ comes. So this is the beginning. And then, this is another one. All right, so this is included because solidarity then starts with this sense in which we want to introduce a fraternal spirit into the social order, into social relations. So I like to call this is the spirit of he ain't heavy, he's my brother. Do you remember that? He ain't heavy, he's my brother. So unfortunately, this is the sister down here, but sort of my son climbed to the top of a mountain with his sister on his back. And this is, we kept saying, well, we'll carry her. No, I want to carry her. She's my sister. So this is the part of solidarity which gets you, we're all responsible for all, kind of this interdependence. The fraternal part is a familial relation of rough equality. So if you want to find a familial relation, right, of rough equality, you have to pick brothers or siblings, fraternity. So it turns out to be interesting to note that if you ask where solidarity enters the English language, it enters, as far as we know, in about 1841. That's according to the etymology of the word. And it comes from the French solidarité. So this was in French before it was in English. And it was in French, kicking around a lot in the French language around the same time as the French Revolution. And they had this other word kicking around, fraternité, right? So fraternity and solidarity have a close bearing. So this part about the fraternal charity in solidarity is fairly important. Now, before you get worried that now that I'm invoking the French Revolution, heads are going to be rolling. This is what's great about solidarity is that we immediately, as soon as we've identified fraternity, we want to kind of pull it in and make sure we understand that what the point of this fraternity is in the next place. So there's no room for the guillotine. We go from fraternity right to charity. So charity is the willing of the good of each and every other person. And this is where, and I'll show you sort of directly where we get the bridge to the common good, right? So that sense in which solidarity is a commitment to the common good, where does that come from? So it comes from this second stage. Now we're thinking about, in general, when we're thinking about solidarity, we're kind of thinking about the love of those that we do not naturally love. So strictly speaking, this includes our family and close friends, but when we think about sort of fraternal charity, we're thinking about those that we must try to love like a family, even though they are not by nature part of our family. Okay, so I can't unpack for you the tradition on charity, but I will say that for thinking about the kind of charity we have in mind, we're thinking about solidarity. I don't think there's a better source than St. Thomas on the order of charity. There's a kind of a rich sort of set of ideas in St. Thomas on kind of the order of charity is the best thing to call it, right? Kind of who we should love first and how we should love everybody. So this is a really neat set of things. This is found in the second part of the Summa. It's very helpful. So I pulled out a few things from there, right? So we know what to love is. By the way, I think a lot of this defining of solidarity works equally well with the term friendship. Right? So to love is to will the good of another. So then a lot of questions arise, and this is where we have some help from Thomas. So for example, I'm pulling one sort of, for example, do we have to love everyone in the world equally? For example, it's a good question, right? If we're supposed to love everybody, how's that work exactly? And so Thomas says no, we don't have to love everyone in the world equally. So love can be unequal in two ways: in the wishing of the good for others. So we should have equal wishing of good for others. We should wish everyone the full good, which is everlasting happiness. But in the intensity of the action towards others, well, this has to be unequal. It's not really possible for it to be equal. So this, I think, provides a little bit of relief. This is sort of, we have to love everybody, to wish the good for them equally, but we don't have to sort of have the same intensity of action towards all persons. And then this raises more questions than it answers. And many of those questions are kind of following on this in the Summa. Another example, which is sort of important, is the idea in the order of charity that we should love those who are near to us sort of more immediately than those who are far away from us. And we should also love those for whom we have a particular responsibility. So Thomas says, well, we should love the people for whom, if we neglected to take care of them, it would be a great travesty. So he kind of works through these things. And finally, and I've just pulled out, I think, a few that I think are especially relevant for thinking about solidarity. In the same part of the Summa, Thomas sort of sneaks in this little thing. It's sort of in a response. It's sort of very Thomistic thing to do. All of a sudden you're reading through the response to something and you go, wait a minute, did he just say? So he says, he offers us the reason for loving our neighbor. And you think like, well, isn't love a reason enough? I mean, do you need a reason to be loving your neighbor? And he says that the reason for loving, fellowship in the full participation of happiness, which is the reason for loving one's neighbor. And then he wants to go on. He's actually answering a question about whether you should love your neighbor more than you love your own body. It's a really interesting question. But he sort of sneaks in there this idea that, this isn't the only place Thomas does this, but it's right in there in the order of charity, that the reason for loving is to have fellowship or oneness or unity in the full participation of human happiness. And this just is the common good. So participated happiness in Thomas is the common good. So here is this, so there's a couple of points here. One is it's important to see that the reason for the charity, the reason for the loving is not on its own to be loving, right? That love, the goal of loving in some sense is the unity, right? So the goal of loving is to be united with the beloved. So actually the unity is the thing you're seeking in the end. We don't love God just to love God because that's our duty. So this is kind of this sense of the separation between the moral life and the speculative end of man, which is so common. So in solidarity, it's the same, that the goal of all of this loving stuff we're supposed to be doing, the friendship that we're supposed to foster with our neighbors and with our colleagues and the poor, the goal of that is actually to have unity with other people and unity in this participated happiness, which is the common good. So here's our bridge to the common good. How am I doing on time? Okay, so this is the end of the schema, right? So we get from fraternity to charity to unity. Okay. So let's go back to solicitudo. Beyond human and natural bonds already so close and strong, there is discerned in the light of faith a new model of the unity of the human race, which must ultimately inspire solidarity. So this is kind of, it's sort of implicit there. So charity then is the primary substantive of solidarity, but unity is its special orientation, right? That's where it's aiming. So I want to make this point a little bit more practical. This doesn't encapsulate everything, but there's this great story from when the Sisters of Charity are moving to San Francisco, when the diocese invites them into San Francisco, and they renovate an old diocesan building for the Missionaries of Charity. I don't know if it was a convent or a rector's, and they renovate this building, and they, new carpeting and new appliances, and then Mother gets there, and do you know Mother gets there, and she says, I don't think we'll be needing that carpet, and it's brand new, and she's rolling it up, throws it out the window. She goes down, they say, well, we put a new water heater in here, you can cook for, 100 people in here. She said, I don't think we'll be needing the water heater. And they're looking at her like, you don't need a water heater? So her point was, well, we don't just aim to serve, we don't just aim to be charitable, we want to actually unite ourselves with the poor. The poor don't have nice carpets, the poor don't have water heaters. So now, we're not all called to be Mother Teresa, but but that's solidarity. Solidarity goes beyond charity and says, I want to experience what the beloved is experiencing. Right, so you need this unity thing too. So to make it even more concrete, if you're going to a soup kitchen and you're dishing out the food, would be charity. Solidarity would be to share a meal with the people that you're serving. So you got to have this extra piece, or you said the aiming at that extra piece. So that's the way we have to think about what it is. Now this is really hard, and this is kind of, this isn't like easy stuff to think about how this would work. But that's the difference. That's what solidarity. I'm going to go back. That's what solidarity adds to charity. So an interesting question is if solidarity is just charity, why do we need to call it solidarity? Why do we need an extra term? Why do we need a new term? So one way to think about it would be just, well, the church likes to throw terms around. People like to throw terms around. The church just wants to co-opt a term that was convenient. It was lying around after the French Revolution. And really, we just mean charity. But I don't think that's right. I think a close reading of the tradition on solidarity says it's something different. There's something extra. And I think it's this thing that we think about in the spiritual life, which is that the goal is unity with the beloved. So the love in a certain sense, and I don't know if I'd want to put this in right, the love in a certain sense is a means to the real goal, which is unity. Okay. So with this in hand, I can get this. I think we can go back to some of the things that seemed kind of fuzzy before. And once you sort of have this idea of unity arising from friendship, unity arising from fraternal charity, some of those fuzzy passages start to make a lot more sense. That you actually start to see those three things every time solidarity is mentioned. And so for me, at least now, I can read that and I think, okay, I think I know what's going on here. I've already read the part of from Solicitudo 38 and 40. So 38 we already had. In 40, right, so we have solidarity is undoubtedly a Christian virtue. Note how he says it's possible to identify many points of contact between solidarity and charity. And then at that point, then he moves into the brotherhood, right? Beyond natural and human bonds, which are already so close, there's this unity. So I've already mentioned this, but you start to see that pattern in there, that sort of triplex. Now, if you turn to Centesimus, I think this becomes even more clear. So John Paul in Centesimus says, the principle of solidarity is frequently stated by Pope Leo, who uses the term friendship, right? Friendship and charity, a concept already found in Greek philosophy. And then Paul VI calls this social charity. And then we have the civilization of love. So we're all kind of these referring to all of these things. So I have more of these, but I'm going to skip forward to this mention of the Greeks. So this should sort of amaze you at this point. I don't know, it amazed me, but he's like, well, John Paul II says it was already in the Greeks, so you go back. Well, I've pulled for you something from Aristotle's Politics. For friendship we believe to be the greatest good of states and preservative of them against revolutions, neither is there anything with which Socrates so greatly lauds as the unity of the state, which he and all the world declare to be arising from or created by friendship. So the unity arising from friendship or fraternal charity. So of course in the Christian tradition, this kind of human friendship is perfected. So the sphere of people with whom you can have that kind of friendship is expanded to include all men, right, in Christ. So that almost kind of, I think that kind of jumps off the page. So I think I have about 3 minutes for some practical thoughts. Sort of, now we know what solidarity is, how to apply this in the marketplace. And as I said, or promised, this is a lot less practical than it probably should be. So some thoughts, but I think this can be helpful. I mean, you all are in very different circumstances, so I think just getting clear about what solidarity is, or what I think it is, and I have no authority to define solidarity, but I think that it could be very helpful to think about how to apply this in your different settings. But here's a couple of points. The first point is that, and this is really sort of, again, really basic point. So solidarity, once we got clear about it, it's not social justice. Okay, so I just want to say that because, you know, when we're talking about Catholic social thought, a lot of times we think everything falls under social justice. And a lot of stuff does fall under social justice, but solidarity is not social justice, it's social charity. So there are two separate concepts. So when Benedict is saying this thing, which was in the literature for this conference, without internal forms of solidarity and mutual trust, the market cannot completely fulfill its proper economic function. Principle of gratuitousness and the logic of gift as an expression of fraternity can and must find their place. Okay, so, you know, most economists I know are kind of like jumping off of their seats, kind of jumping out of windows when they read the Catholic economists, you know, like this is terrible, you know, Benedict is saying that we have to replace the market functions with gift and gratuitousness. I mean, I'm completely serious if you don't know people like that, or maybe you feel, but so what is Benedict saying, and is this completely disastrous? We can't make any sense out of this. And I think it's really, when we understand that solidarity is not social justice, this is not a problem. So this isn't, solidarity does not principally refer to exchanges, human exchanges. It does not principally cover exchanges. It covers relationships, but not exchanges. So under social justice, people should receive what's due to them, and what's due to them we can kind of try to discern through human and natural laws. It's not always so easy, but we can try to do that. So solidarity is this law of charity, by which we don't give others what is due, we give others what is their good. To figure out what is their good. And ordinarily, so as a starting point, what is their good will include what is due to them, right? But then what is also their good might be above and beyond what was due to them. But it's also kind of principally not the material stuff, if people are not material beings, right? So it's not principally, their good is not principally giving them stuff. It's going to include that, it may include that. But chiefly we do that through friendship. Okay, so justice is not charity. It's sort of perfects. It's higher. So my second point is that practical point is that solidarity requires and presupposes actual friendship. So when we're thinking about how to sort of work with solidarity in the marketplace, we have to think about what friendship actually is. So it's very difficult to think that we're sort of fostering or facilitating friendship when we don't know anybody. So my husband likes to say none of us has any idea how the food gets to our table. We don't know how farmers work. We don't know what they think of it. I mean, most of us anyway, at least have no idea. I can't grow anything. So it's difficult when we think about, now this is fantastic for us to think about solidarity as friendship because we have such a rich pastoral tradition on friendship. We know what friendship is. We know how to get there. And friendship presupposes real knowledge. So you can't love someone or know or become friends with them if you don't sort of know something about them. So I have this Starbucks thing here, not to pick on Starbucks, but I thought this was funny. But not to pick on Starbucks, but I think that there's this thing. I mean, I tried to find a picture of it. You go into Starbucks now, and it's like there's a little picture of Jose, and Jose like picked your beans, and Jose was paid a fair wage. And although I think that's kind of silly on a certain level, it represents a certain impulse, which is the impulse to actually know who's on the other end of the exchange. And that's a human impulse. We want to know that so I think that solidarity would tell us we should prefer exchanges in which we can know people. Now, but I don't think the picture of Jose in Starbucks sort of accomplishes that. I actually think, so that's not the idea, but that's sort of, it's kind of hinting in the right direction. And I think when we think about this, there's a lot of problematic things that arise that are related to the sort of digital and virtual marketplace and the global marketplace and so on and so forth. And I'm just going to raise that question. But I think solidarity would require some kind of real attempt at aiming at knowing people. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that kind of knowing needs to take place from the end consumer to the other end supplier, right? But that there should be relationships padding all of this. I should be able. I don't want to know Jose, but I might want to know my barista, right? But I should think that somebody at Starbucks knows Jose pretty well and has a good relationship. So those kind of relationships are supposed to be doing this thing that Benedict is saying, so that there's these internal forms of solidarity and trust. And the market's going to work better because people have real friendships with each other. Is that hard? Is there some policy which achieves this? No, there's no policy which achieves this. Yes, this is hard. This presupposes personal virtue. A very brief third point is that although a lot of solidarity is going to include and be related to the giving of gifts, right? So this is clear, and the place where we think about the giving of gifts is included under solidarity. However, when we think about kind of capturing solidarity in the sense of friendship and unity, it's important to recognize that this can help us define the kinds of gifts that we aim to give. So that old thing about, if you teach, give a man a fish versus teaching a man a fish, this actually kind of makes sense under solidarity when we think about the kinds of gifts which are worthy of giving to friends. So if we aim to give gifts like friends, we may prefer to give the gift of a job or to create jobs, for example. I'm just picking one thing, versus giving material donations. So that kind of solidarity can be purified by the notion of friendship. Fourth and fifthly are kind of two sides of the same coin. Solidarity corrects against individualism on the one hand. Right? It's meant to be corrective of individualism. John Paul's very clear about that. And on the other hand, solidarity is meant to correct against collectivism. Right? And this is an important point because I think my students tend to sort of approach the literature on these things as thinking about thinking about capitalism and communism as two extremes. I mean, capitalism and communism are not two extremes. That's just that's not the other end of so communism is a part of a kind of collectivist, part of the collectivist ideas, and at the other end is individualism, So capitalism is a different thing, and it's not on this. It's not on this spec. So if we reject collectivism, we're not embracing capitalism. But if we reject socialism, we may be in danger of embracing individualism. It's solidarity, which is meant to say it's not in the middle between them, but it's a different thing which allows us to reject both ends. It's supposed to keep us sort of sane. And I think that so I'm going to kind of end with this. Isn't a very practical point, but it was a helpful point. So this is Pope Francis earlier this week in Albania. Each one must experience the call to dedicate themselves generously to the announcing of the gospel and to witness of charity, called to strengthen the bonds of solidarity as to create more just and fraternal living conditions for all. So you're seeing the same formulation again, that there's kind of the announcing of the gospel, the strengthening of bonds, the unity, right? So solidarity is this kind of unity. I find this triplex of unity, fraternal charity very helpful for cutting through a lot of the talking around what solidarity is. So I find this helpful. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mary Hirshfeld. She's now completing her doctoral dissertation in the area of moral theology at Notre Dame. Her emphasis is going to be on a Thomistic framework for economics, and she's doing it with a special emphasis on consumption. Her topic today is going to be one I think of interest to all of you, and that is, what is private property and how does solidarity fit into that framework? So Mary, if you would, thank you very much.
In contrast to this idea that we are autonomous individuals, the church has a strong view of the human person as intrinsically social. And as we just heard, this is not to be misunderstood as thinking we're subsumed into the state, right? But it's to understand the individual as being completed or fulfilled in relationship with others, that's essential to human nature. What I want to do is give you three passes at this idea. First, theologically, and this you already know, we're made in the image and likeness of God. And as Catholics, we worship a triune God who is essentially relational. It therefore follows that we ourselves are essentially relational, that we are completed in each other. And I think what we also just heard that's important to stress is a lot of our call to solidarity is our call for the fellowship of the joy of we're all made in the image and likeness of God. We share that goodness together, and there's something in the sharing of the good that amplifies and completes the good. Okay, so that's a theological strand. Philosophically, if you go back to your Aristotle or Plato, humans reach perfection as rational creatures, as rational animals, and as Aristotle will say, also as political animals. And I think these two things are connected, because if you think about what it means to be a rational person, that means you're a person who is able to pursue knowledge of the true, knowledge of the good, knowledge of the beautiful. But how can we do that on our own? We're all finite people with our small perspectives. If we're trying to approach these larger absolute goods, we do it in conversation with one another, largely, right? We do it by talking to each other. So the very fact that I'm standing before you now using language that you can understand marks me out as a rational being who is also impossible to imagine without community, because I would have no language without a community. I would have no way to begin even reflecting on anything without the words that we have given each other through our social lives as being. One way I like to tell my students to see this, how intrinsically important our social natures are, is to consider the fact that if you want to punish somebody after the death penalty, the second worst thing you can do to somebody is put them in solitary confinement, apart from other people, okay? So what's the point of saying that? That's saying that we're incomplete without each other. I'm not even intelligible as a person apart from you, right? And vice versa. So if I'm looking for my own fulfillment, I can't possibly be looking for it as that atomistic, autonomous individual, right? Because that's just not who I am. So my whole fulfillment has to have something to do with my social connections. And with that comes a natural inclination or disposition to care for the people who are so essential to me, and vice versa. Okay. But the third way that I think you can see our essentially social nature is by looking at our economic life. The church fathers noted that the fact that we are disposed to trade, especially international trade, is a mark of our interdependence. It's God's providential ordering to remind us in our everyday lives that we are in fact dependent on each other. I like to draw on this, for this point I like to draw on the not Catholic, not church father guy named Adam Smith, who starts his Wealth of Nations. Okay, so he says, where does the wealth of nations come from? And it doesn't come from an abundance of material goods or resources. It doesn't come even from a special amount of hard work. It doesn't come from a lot of ingenuity or entrepreneurship. The very first thing he says out of the gate is, where does our great wealth come from? It lies in the fact that we are able to specialize, right? The division of labor allows us to specialize, and by working together, we end up being fantastically more productive than we are when we work on our own. Economists like to say there's no such thing as a free lunch, but in some sense, at the heart of our economic lives is a ginormous free lunch by virtue of the mere fact that we're working together. So since my aim here is remedial, I want to give you two quick examples so this can sink in as fully as possible. The first is, think of your shirt. Just ponder your shirt for a minute. And I want to ask you, as you think about your shirt, how long it would take you to make your own shirt, okay? Now, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to cheat for you. I'm going to give you a how-to manual so you can have all the accumulated human wisdom on how to make a shirt, okay? And I'm going to cheat even more. I'm going to give you some tools that other human beings have made for you so that you can have a loom. I'll give you a needle, okay? And I'm going to cheat a little bit further, and I'm going to let you have the cotton already be grown, okay? You don't have to wait for the cotton to grow. But think about it. How long does it take you to take that cotton, put it through the machine to get rid of the seeds, put it through the other machine to get it spun into thread, to get that thread put up on the loom, right, woven into cloth? Now you want to have a colored shirt, you're going to have to start the dye process from scratch, right? So you do all that, you dye it, okay? Now maybe you want a button, start that from scratch. You guys get this picture? How long does it take you to make your shirt? Okay, now, think about how long you had to work at whatever it is that you do in order to get enough money to go out and buy your shirt. That difference, 1 hour to buy your shirt by trading your money that you earned in the market versus, in my case, probably 2 weeks to make the shirt, that's the social dividend we get just by virtue, by the fact that we cooperate together in the marketplace. Okay. The other quick example I have is pick your most favorite successful, entrepreneurial, hardworking, this guy really deserved every penny he's got guy. I'll pick Bill Gates. I don't know if he fits those qualities or not. But could Bill Gates possibly reproduce his living standard if he was left on his own? Right? And the answer, however much value he's created for us, it's a social value he's created because he couldn't possibly reproduce it for himself if he was isolated, producing for himself in splendid autarky. Okay. So what's the point of that? The point is that when you think about private property, it's a good institution for channeling our private efforts to our rewards, and that has its place. But it's also dividing up what really is a very large social dividend, because we're essentially social. And with that then comes, I think, at least for me, a reconception of private property is something where, yes, I have earned what I have worked for, but I also owe society, right? There's a relationality to my ownership of that private property that's part of it. Okay. So all of that is to say that we, as human beings, pursue our goals, but we also have this natural social connectedness. And that means when we make our decisions, when we interact with others, we need to keep these two tiers in mind. We need to be able to work to pursue our own interests, properly understood, but also work for the benefit of others, both through justice and solidarity. And I thought that was a nice distinction that's been made. Okay, what's the other obstacle, though? And this is the one that I spend a whole lot of my time working on. And that is our relationship with material wealth. Okay. Now, my guess is you're going to expect, and it's sort of true, that I'm about to tell you that our problem with material wealth is that we're too greedy. But it's going to be a little bit more subtle than that. Okay. But let me show you why our relationship with material wealth creates a problem for how we understand private property. Okay. And I need to take a drink of water. Hang on a sec. Okay. The apparent tension arises when you look at Thomas Aquinas' account of private property. This was a huge landmark in my own intellectual development. In training in theology at Notre Dame, I picked up Aquinas on private property and wanted him to say beautiful things about it. But what he said seemed to me to be utterly and completely confusing. So let me draw you into my confusion and then draw you back out of the confusion, and hopefully we'll be in a better place when we're done. Okay. So he says, is private property allowable? He's writing against a tradition that's been suspicious, to say the least, of private property, where there's some thought that maybe private property is permissible only as a concession to sin. But he wants to say, no, actually, private property is appropriate to human beings, even if they had not been fallen. And he says to see this, he says it helps to look at private property in two lights, from two different angles. First, with respect to what he calls the power to procure and disperse, by which he means the power to manage and then allocate the fruits of what has been produced by the management. And second, with respect to use. He says, from that first angle, with respect to the power to procure and disperse, private property, big thumbs up. It's absolutely appropriate. And he gives three reasons for this. And I'm going to take them backwards for dramatic effect. The first one he says is because we're likely to bicker. It would be better to have private property to avoid all that. You know, that's mine, mine, mine. Okay. So that's clearly understanding private property as a concession to sin. Right? So that's just right in line with the tradition. His second reason put my little economist heart aflutter, because he says, if we didn't assign private property, people of goodwill would get up in the morning wanting to go out and work for the common good, but they would have no idea where to go. There would be massive confusion. You know, if all the fields need to be cultivated, who's to say who gets the potato field and who gets the leek field? But private property allows us to know where to go. And I think in that reason we can graft in a lot of the great insight we get from economists about specialization. If I have the potato field and that's my domain, I know everything about the potato field. I know what weather works for it, what doesn't. I know what fertilizers to put in, when it should be. I know all that. That's my responsibility. And if you've got the leek field, you've got that covered too. And with that specialization, we get that synergy that I already talked about that's so productive for all of us. Okay? Now, his first one, and this is where things got a little tricky for me, was the reason why private property is fitting with respect to the power to procure and disperse is because every person is more diligent to work for themselves than they would be to work for the generic common good. Okay, so as an economist, I hear that as, yes, people need to have incentives in order to be motivated to work. So where's my problem? My problem is, he says, when we think about private property in the second light, with respect to how it should be used, we should use it as though it were in common. That is to say, ready to communicate to others in their need, to share to others when they need them. Okay, so I was up all night with this. How do you put that together? How am I supposed to have enough incentive to go out and work for myself when I'm supposed to then turn around and pretend that this is like as if in common, whereas like for the common good? Okay, and my paper was due at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was terrible, terrible, terrible. So I had to call my advisor and say, you're not getting a paper. All right, here's the way it finally unpacks. When Aquinas talks about everybody's more careful to work for themselves, he's talking about people being more careful to work for the material goods that they need. Okay? And when we think about incentives, we think about people being more careful to procure for themselves in some sort of indefinite, open-ended way. Because when Aquinas talks about what is the good of material well-being, he has a rather different idea than we do. What he wants to stress is that material goods are only ever instrumental. And by instrumental, he means that we desire them for the sake of the good that they secure. Okay? So I desire my shirt because I don't want you guys to see me naked, and maybe hopefully it has a little style to it or not. I'll let you judge. But whenever we buy a material good, we have some end in mind, some purpose that that good is supposed to serve. Okay. Now here's where I want to say that Aquinas is not just saying we should not be greedy. Because you might worry that then his claim is going to be, we should keep our needs minimal. We should only have enough material goods to serve the most basic possible needs. But when he elaborates what kind of ends can material goods serve, he has a rather modern sounding account. Of course you need the material goods it takes for you to survive biologically. You need your food, you need your shelter, you need your clothing. But because we are social animals, it is also fitting and right that you would have sufficient material goods to live in a manner that would be becoming, right? So it's not just enough to have a hair shirt, it's good to have the clothes that are appropriate for your social situation, right? It's nice to decorate your house, all these sorts of things. He even goes on and shares with Aristotle the idea that some of the virtues you could point to are things like magnificence, which has to do with spending large sums of money well. So he could talk about a virtuous person who had endowed a library, that sort of thing. And he thinks material goods are perfectly useful, properly used, to pursue things like the arts and crafts or other things that allow you to exercise your talents, make you a better or more excellent being. So now I've just set out a list of all the sorts of things that would be reasons why we would want to have more things, okay, that moderns would see that way. Okay. So what is the difference between Aquinas' view and ours? And this is the signal and important difference that's very hard, I think, for us to get. Aquinas thinks that our desire for material goods should be measured or bounded by the ends they're meant to serve. And what does that mean? Because we think that we want the material goods for ends, so what does it mean to say they're measured or bounded? And he uses, drawing on Aristotle, the example of medicine and health. So the idea is, if I have a headache right now, and it takes 2 aspirin for me to cure my headache, then I want exactly 2 aspirin, right? The headache is measuring my demand for the aspirin. I don't want 4 aspirin or 10 aspirin or 20 aspirin. They don't help me a bit. Once my headache is cured, I'm done with the aspirin. That's what it means to have an instrumental good measured by its end. Okay, once it's served its purpose, it's done. So the idea is you should have precisely the same relationship with material wealth. If you judge that it takes $75,000 a year for you to maintain a life that's ordered to the goods you've discerned through prudence, through your practical wisdom, then that's what you need, and you don't need any more. Okay. Now, if you take that, and I'm going to come back to why it's difficult, but if you take that as right, then private property falls out as easy as you like. What's Aquinas' account? Private property is a wonderful institution. It's fitting to human nature. It's fitting to our finitude. It allows us to channel our creativity into defined parts of the universe, to channel our natural inclination to care for ourselves to productive uses that benefit all of society. That natural concern to provision ourselves fuels us to work hard, but then if we end up with an abundance of more than what we need, we have natural abundance available to share with others. And since you have literally no need for that extra surplus, why wouldn't you share it with others, right? These are your friends, these are the people you're in solidarity with, these are your fellow human beings who are in the image and likeness of God, okay? So it all works. That's how you would live your private property in the spirit of solidarity, right? You have a proper concern for yourself, but then the superabundance that goes and spills out to others. Okay, that's all very nice and beautiful. It would also be extraordinarily hard for anybody in this room to actually do. There are a lot of reasons for this. But the main one is there's been a shift in our society, and in many ways you would want to call it a good shift, but it does create a paradox or a tension for us. The shift is this. In Aquinas' day, there was not a lot of social mobility. And with that came pretty strongly established social norms about what was appropriate for people given their station in life. So if I'm the baker, people have a general idea about what, and I have a general idea about what is the right house for a baker, what's the right standard of dress, what's the right mode of living. And if I have a good baker year, I'm making great bread and you guys are all coming to buy it from me, my standard of living is still set, and so all that extra income is just this surplus, right, that I would then turn around and share with others without any sense of loss. Okay. With the rise of social mobility, which has many goods with it, comes this idea that our proper standard of living, our proper station in life is measured by the income that we have earned. So if you work really hard and you make a lot of money, then you are now allowed to rise to a higher station. But notice what happens. If your income goes up and your appropriate standard of living goes up, there is no surplus. right? So there's no, and if there's never any surplus, how could you ever feel that giving to other people isn't anything but some kind of sacrifice that you have to make on your own? Okay. Right along with that, and there's just so much involved in this nexus. Even if you manage to pull yourself out of that and think, well, I don't have to go along with that norm, so I can still work hard to be successful, but then figure out what is the place where I want to be and stop, and then everything else would be surplus. Part of the problem is that we are social. A lot of these social standards are socially developed through norms, right? So even if I'm trying to opt out of that game and be reasonable and restrained so that I can have this abundance to share with others, my neighbors aren't. And they start doing things that impact me, like they adopt cell phones, and all of a sudden I have to have a cell phone in order to be socially able to interact with people in ways that people think are proper. They're going to have standards for how my house should look and what sort of trim should be put on it and so on. And if they're raising their standard of living as their income goes up, then I'm going to have to be pulled up along with them. So there's kind of this rat race or nexus. Okay. And then on top of all of that, we just have a culture that's built on this idea that more is better, that the way to get more happiness is to have more. And we tend to think, and this is true of a lot of goods, but we have this idea that pursuing the good is pursuing a string of goods, pursuing a ladder of goods. So just tell me if this doesn't sound, if this doesn't sound familiar to you. You contemplate the possibility of getting a little bit of extra income, and you have a list of things that you'd like to meet, right? So in my case, I have a 30-year-old roof and a 30-year-old HVAC, so if I ever got some extra income, those things would be fixed. But then my fantasy will go, but what if I got a little bit more, right? Well, my bathroom could use remodeling. The shower doesn't drain right. It's really ugly, okay? Maybe that's a reasonable thing to do. But what if I had more income? Well, my kitchen could be redone. You know, there's all these books, and I'm kind of tired of having to go to the library for them. It would be nice to have them on my shelves. And I keep going and going. Everybody's got their endless lists. And it doesn't even have to be an endless list for material goods. Here's all the books I want to read. I want to read this book and that book and that book, and it just goes on, okay? Here's all the experiences I want to have. I want to go to this country. I want to have this kind of dinner with people, and so on and so forth. It's culture-wide on all sorts of fronts, this idea that the way to get happier is to get more of something, to go up this ladder, okay? But notice what that does. It means we're always feeling constrained. We're always short of our list. And if we're always feeling constrained, it's hard to share our time or to share our money, right? Because we just never quite have enough compared to this endless ladder. Okay. All right. So is there any way out of this conundrum? Is there any way that we can get a right relationship with especially material goods, but with all goods, so that we can more naturally order our lives around the true goods that we can all sit here and in our heads agree are the right ones, the human goods that aren't scarce, right? There's no scarcity involved in the human goods. I have just a few suggestions to make in my remaining moments. Okay, first, love prudence. You should love practical wisdom. You should seek to cultivate practical wisdom. What is practical wisdom? It's understanding that you want to make your decisions not based on some calculation about how to get further down your list, but rather it's how do you exercise your reason to figure out how to make order out of your list so that instead of pursuing this indefinite string of whatevers, you're actually pursuing a set of actions that would make a coherent whole. We are all finite beings. We are all finite beings who are reflections, mirrors of God, who is the infinite good. We don't get to God, the infinite good, by climbing up that ladder, by taking that stairway to heaven, right? We get closer to God by mirroring him in the way finite things can. And how does that happen? It happens through ordering goods, in harmony, looking for fittingness, looking for cohesion, looking for coherence. The way I like to think about it is consider the way poetry works. You don't get great poetry by stringing a lot of beautiful words together. You get great poetry by respecting the finitude of the form and trying to find a way to fit the right words in the right way in the right place. If you started thinking about your own lives that way, it would be easier to step out of this idea as the good is more. And once you do that, I think you'll find you have more abundance because you're looking more for that finite, satiable fittingness. Okay, my second suggestion or my second observation is to notice that there's a large social component to this problem. Like I said, as long as everybody else is ratcheting up their standard of living, it's very, very hard not to move right along with them. In fact, you would have to incur high social costs in many cases to hold back. Okay. So that would mean that if you wanted to embark in the project of getting into right relationship with material goods so that you could be in right relationship with your brothers and sisters, you need to work through a community. It would be helpful to have intentional communities that had a shared conception of the good and a shared idea that they want to pursue the good together. Okay. And finally, I think probably at the end of the day, we also have to admit that it's not likely that we're going to cultivate this virtue anytime soon, either individually or collectively. And then my last suggestion is to say, in that light, you're going to have to suck it up and do the sacrifice bit. But maybe it helps to recognize that the sacrifices you're making are also sacrifices that would move you towards actually a better relationship with the material goods themselves. So those are my thoughts. Thank you for your time.